Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Really lovely to see you here this evening. I'm Vicky Nash, and I'm Deputy Director of the Oxford Internet Institute. And it's my huge pleasure to welcome you to the Oxford Internet Institute's Termly London Lecture. We do this once a term now on the view that we would like to share all the wonderful people that we have in Oxford. We aim to bring to you our leading experts to discuss the social implications of the internet and the role of digital technologies in shaping our economic and social and political futures. The events that we run are free to everyone, and it's just wonderful to see, I have to say, actually lots of familiar faces in the audience tonight, particularly from alumni and policy contexts. That's great, thank you. But to welcome all of you here to this wonderful venue in the IET, and in particular the very appropriate Alan Turing Lecture Theatre. In a minute, I'm going to go on and introduce our wonderful speaker. But before I can do that, maybe just a few housekeeping points. Come on in, it's fine. Come on in if you're standing at the back. First of all, with it being the OII, obviously we would be very delighted for you to use social media throughout the lecture. But if you can do so, making sure that your phones are turned to silent. If you tweet, our Twitter handle is @OII Oxford, and feel free to refer to that during and after the lecture. Second thing, just to flag up, is that we are recording the lecture this evening. So bear that in mind, particularly if you want to ask a question later, that the question that you ask may well be recorded. And then last but not least, if we should hear fire alarms, I believe we're not expecting any drills tonight, so it would be a real fire alarm. Please make your way to the fire exits, which are at the rear of the auditorium and the front of the auditorium, and staff will help you find your way out after that. So, moving on to the main business of the evening, I am just so delighted to introduce you to our speaker tonight, and I'm not just saying that because he's my boss. Phil Howard is obviously Director of the Oxford Internet Institute. He's also Statutory Professor at Balliol College in Oxford. And he is an incredibly prolific and influential academic writing in the sphere of information politics and international affairs. He has produced an incredible 8 books, the most recent of which is Computational Propaganda. We may talk about that perhaps a little bit tonight in questions. And he's won multiple Best Book Awards, not just one, but multiple. And I think you probably are all very familiar with the research and commentary that you will see in some of the sort of highest profile outlets, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others that you would know. 2018 was a particularly good year for him, not merely because he started being my boss, but also because, more importantly, he was named a global thinker by Foreign Policy magazine. And he also won a really wonderful Democracy Prize from the National Democratic Institute for his pioneering work in the area of social science of fake news. For tonight, Phil is going to talk to us about tomorrow's Leviathan, intelligent machines in a political world. And he's going to look at how artificial intelligence is changing our experience of politics and asking whether or not this might somehow change fundamentally, if you like, the sort of democracy terms of service. Now, we're going to have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. We'll probably go till about 7:15, and then there'll be some Q&A. And in the meanwhile, I think I'm just going to hand over to Phil for the evening's lecture. Phil, thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause, please?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. It's particularly exciting for me to present because there's some fresh material that I'm going to try out on you. It involves a base of evidence that we've been collecting over the last few years. So for my 35 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence we have for how automation is used in public life. And for the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what I think this means for the applications that will be developed under the rubric of artificial intelligence for the years ahead. Now, for social scientists, we're not supposed to do prediction, right? It's valuable to be prescient. I'm not aiming for prediction here. I'm aiming to say something prescient about the political circumstances I think we'll find ourselves in fairly short order. Now, to start off, I'm going to say a little bit about the OII and tell you about how we're going to save the world. So the narrative arc here is to get everybody depressed about the prospects for democracy and then rebuild, right? To illustrate how the OII and you can solve the situation. I'm going to run through some scenarios that I think we're likely to face and talk about our strategies for building the public life we'd like. The Oxford Internet Institute is an unusual creation. It's a department within the social sciences, but it's about a third computer scientists and a third humanists and a third social scientists. And our social scientists need to learn to code, and our computer scientists need to learn to think ethically about how they apply their technologies, the things they build. My colleague Victor Mayer-Schonberger is famous for the book Big Data. He made the business case for big data. He wrote the book. He's the reason we have the concept big data in our popular parlance now. And these days it's very difficult to write cogently about technology and AI without either using his understanding of what big data is and why it's valuable, or rejecting it and critiquing it. You have to be able to respond to Victor's ideas. Luciano Floridi's essentially founded information ethics. It's now normal for computer science programs to try and teach ethics somewhere in the programming. They turn to Luciano for his syllabi, because he's been teaching ethics with us at the OII for some 10 years now. Senator Wachter has particularly done some innovative work in the last few months on GDPR and the impact of GDPR, both on how AI is developing and what AI may do to disentangle or complicate GDPR. Much of the work I'll be talking about today was funded. The basic science was supported by the ERC, the European Research Council. It provided support for an extended project. And support from Modicum and Open Society helps us do the public engagement work. So the basic science agencies help with the science part, and the public engagement, working with policymakers, is something that comes from other kinds of philanthropists. Vicky made a sort of veiled reference to how this has been a good year for us or our lab, and in part it's, I would agree, Putin has been good for my career. I would give it all back for it not to be so, but for the last 12 months or so, we've been doing a significant amount of work looking to see how information technologies are used to move public opinion. And about a year ago, I wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post arguing that Facebook could tell us more, that Facebook should testify before Congress. And in the United States, this cracked open a national conversation about having him come, having the technology firms come to discuss, explain what was going on. Then more recently in December, we released a major report that identified the major trends behind the known Russian accounts that had been in operation during the 2016 election. As a result of the op-ed, the Senate Intelligence Committee asked us to play with the data that the firms had turned over. By December 2018, we were able to actually say something public about those trends. Now let me do a quick show of hands. How many of you did politics or political science and have had some taste of Hobbes somewhere in your career? So I expected as much. What I've done is reproduce the frontispiece as a way of reminding you about some of the arc of Hobbes's arguments. What makes Leviathan special is that it's one of the things that makes it special is that it's the longest, best statement for why the state emerges from individual values. The Leviathan is not so much a monster as it is a large, overseeing force generated by our individual wills and our individual interests. And in a sense, what he argues, what Hobbes argues, is that we must surrender ourselves. We leave the state of nature, which is nasty, brutish, and short. We must surrender ourselves to some organization, set of values, that both captures what we want out of public life and protects us, right? We have to trade off. We surrender some rights, and we buy into this thing called the state. What makes the front page particularly powerful for those of us who've encountered the manuscript is that when you look very closely, the Leviathan that stands over the state, that governs us, is actually made up of our individual data points. The important part of Hobbes's argument for me is that the state, in this old political theory sense, is something that's aggregated, that's generated by us, but not fully controlled by us. It's something that constrains us, but also provides capacities and protections. And where I'm going to land at the end of my lecture is with the sense that AI may do similar things for us, encompass us, contain us, and provide us with some capacities, but also some constraints. Now, the reasons to be excited about AI in politics or governance are similar to the reasons why we want a Leviathan that's strong and healthy. This is the organization of state that protects us from life that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In our original state of nature, we're constantly under threat of violence, and what we fear is the violent death. The Leviathan protects us from that, shields us from that. But in order to create that commonwealth, we give up some rights. Now, one of the parts of Hobbes that I won't use is his preference for monarchy. He argues that democracy invites too many passions to be interpretable by the Leviathan. What I will say, I hope you pick up, is a sense of hope that AI may bring some level of rationality to political conversations that politicians currently can't give or aren't giving. But let me take you there with a few definitions. Because of how Hobbes set up the role of the state in managing our affairs, he allows us to create a definition. There's many definitions of what politics is. I think my favorite is that politics occurs when one person tries to represent another person's interests. I'm going to use a fairly straightforward definition of AI. I'm not going to unpack AI. There's many different kinds of machine learning applications. I'll give a few examples of what these look like in contemporary politics and how these things are being imagined for us now. But for the most part, the AIs that I'm speaking of are collections of algorithms and data that simulate learning, reasoning, and classification. And my goal here towards the end is to put together the definition of what politics is or has been with what it will be in a world managed in part by artificial intelligence. To lay the groundwork for this, let me say a little bit about how automation currently works in our political lives. Most of the data that we've played with has come from Twitter. When we study a bot, those of you who have Twitter, you all have bots following you. There are some manual heuristics that we can use as individuals when we look at a Twitter account. Very strange ratios of followers to following. Unusually fast rates of productivity, right? Messages every few seconds, or no messages, or completely erratic messages. These are the cues that we can use as humans to decide who in our social network is following us is not a real person. In this case, the bear might give it away, but some of the accounts we look for are the Russian origin accounts. Sometimes they will make a slip that's easy to catch. They'll switch into Cyrillic and then go back into working in English. Other than having those basic attributes, it takes some fairly sophisticated machine learning to actually identify which accounts are fully automated or even partially automated. I mean this as a methodology point, not a Trump joke, but when we start a fresh scoop of data, we often start with Trump's followers list. He has among the best collections of troll accounts and fake accounts. They're accounts that are all numbers, right? Or accounts with no pictures, who never tweet, or all tweet at once suddenly on an unexpected topic. Now, what's poisonous for public life is when these accounts are used to push junk news. Images of Muslim women coming up on the beach of your favorite resort in hijab. People storming borders, right? Doctored images. These particular examples originated with Russia today, but the poisonous part here is the automation that is behind fake news, the misinformation that then introduces a modicum of doubt. At this point, we've studied many different kinds of countries. We've studied both authoritarian regimes and democracies. And I'll say a few things about the kinds of investments governments are making in automated manipulation of public life. To study this stuff takes both a computational method and some qualitative work, because it's often the qualitative work that brings home the punchline. Right? One of our colleagues has returned from Poland a little over a year ago after doing some field work with a firm that manages 40,000 fake Facebook accounts. Who do you think would rent tens of thousands of fake Facebook accounts? It turns out this firm, their number one clients are not politicians. They don't sell them, they rent them out, right? Because these are accounts that are maintained by people who work for the factory and keep them fresh with content. What industry would rent fake Facebook users? Arms, good guess, but no, not in this case. Sorry? Reviews, no, again, a good guess. The Kardashians are responsible for some of the best bots. Right? The politicians have copied the bots produced for reviews and commercial enterprises. One more guess?
Newspapers.
Not newspapers, pharmaceuticals. So you rent 10,000 people to have migraines and complain about their migraines in public space, and then 10,000 more to have a new medication for managing the migraines in their lives. They have the public interaction, and the firm manages the content behind the public interaction. So the qualitative work with the quantitative work, and then being able to compare across countries to say something about the global trends, is key to understanding the role of automation in public life. Now I'm going to go through 3 charts that were the core part of the analysis we provided to the Senate Intelligence Committee about the known Russian accounts involved in 2016. The first punchline is fairly straightforward and would be intuitive to anyone who loves politics. The peaks in Russian activity on Facebook in this particular chart map very closely to events on the electoral calendar. These are not random surges of account activity. They are lined up for the moments a candidate declares. They're lined up for the moment there's a national debate. That's when the activity blooms. On this chart, I want you to notice that the bulk of the activity is after November 2016. So these are accounts that social media platforms decided had been run from St. Petersburg for an extended period. They were turned over to the Senate Intelligence Committee in the summer of 2018, but they cover a period right up until the end point of the data, towards the end of 2017. Much of the activity is after the election. This graph traces the activity across 6 different platforms. I want to draw your eye to 2 of the lines. First, regarding Instagram and Facebook ads. In our public conversation about what's been going on, both in terms of politics in Europe and the UK and in the US, we tend to be focused on Facebook ads. Right? These are political ads that don't disclose who paid for them, but might be trying to get you to go in a different direction with your political information. It turns out that the political ads are not the bulk of the content, at least generated by the Russians. The bulk of it is actually not Twitter or Facebook. The Russians migrated in the early stages, when it was about Twitter and Facebook, to being mostly about Instagram now. So the platforms of choice change. The most agile political communication strategy you can have is not dependent on a platform. And what's special about Instagram now, and really difficult for us to study as social scientists, is that it tends to be made up mostly of images, right? Images that can be doctored, but with Twitter we could analyze text, and it was easier to get a handle on what was producing text. It's much more difficult to study content, political content, that's being produced over Instagram. Now, to the question of what was being delivered. There were 3 themes we picked up on. The particular kinds of content, this is about moving public opinion, tended to be about African-American political identity. To some degree, it was about voter disenfranchisement, because the messages were, Hillary Clinton, if you're African-American, Hillary Clinton can't represent you, don't vote. Boycott the election, because your particular community isn't represented by the politicians who are running. So the Russian strategy here was to link community identity with not voting. Right? We find this later on in this particular sample of accounts with reference to Latinos and Hispanics. The second largest community was a much more amorphous community of content targeted towards the far right. So there were fewer accounts that were very high active targeting African Americans. There was a much larger population of accounts on the far right. These are not small c conservatives. This is the ultra-right. This content lasted for the entire duration of the sample that we were given. And later in the game, later in the sample we were given, there's more attention to Hispanics, Latino Americans, and Latino identity within the United States. Again, somewhat linked to not participating, right? Institutions won't serve you or your ethnicity. They won't help you seek relief from the state. Don't participate. Now let me say something about the scenarios that I think are ahead of us. I believe there may be 3 stages to the development of political AI. I think it will be very difficult to create AIs that address public policy questions without at some point taking on ideology. I believe we're already at this first stage in which automation is used to push public opinion. It's very difficult for us as social scientists to create statistical models to model the impact of one tweet on one vote. We don't have those mechanisms yet. We can say a lot in experimental settings. We can still measure the proportion of the American public who thinks that something was going on in that pizzeria, right, outside Washington, D.C. You can still measure the proportion of the public in many countries that believe some of the more ridiculous stories about their political leaders. So we know there are lasting effects. We just can't link them. We can't model them as related to a particular tweet or Facebook post. I think the thing that we may understand as AI or sophisticated machine learning applications will emerge when public services, public administration decides to turn to AI to help with rationalizing public resources. I imagine health is one of the logical domains in which we'll see this. Military allocations of assets, one of the domains which we already see this. I would call this, amongst the things that the state does, a form of service provision. So I think we already have the first chapter involving public opinion manipulation. I think ahead of us is the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, to help solve the allocation problem for limited public resources. 3 steps away is the provision of governance goods. And in political theory, we tend not to think of governance as a broad range of services provided by a state, because most states fail at some point. They either fail in some domain when there's a complex natural disaster, or they're very weak. Most states provide a basket of goods to their citizens, and we call these governance goods because they vary from state to state. The United States provides very few public health goods. They regulate industry well, but there's no collectivized medicine. Here, there is, and so we speak of health in this way as a governance good. What makes governance goods important is that they are a mode of political service delivery that involves sanction. If some of your citizens are not behaving well, they don't get the governance goods. The goods are withdrawn. And one of the things that governments, especially welfare states, have trouble doing is monitoring the allocation of resources that flow over various communities and withdrawing or restricting from the communities that don't need them as much anymore, or reallocating to the communities that do need more. So I think down the road, after the more simple, straightforward use of machine learning to provide services, what we would call tax services or health services, will be this stage of providing governance goods. Now, to give you a sense of which states are leading in this, I want to pull out some data that we collected regarding public expenditure on public opinion manipulation across some 48 countries. We did a survey to see which governments actually had dedicated budgets, or which countries had political parties spending tens of thousands of pounds, dollars, euros on public opinion manipulation. Using open source documentation, we found 48 governments, 48 countries with either governments or political parties doing this work. So I've given you a taste of what was going on in the United States in 2016. This is now a global industry. For the 48 states, there were 46 of them who employed staff to push online commentary, right? And these are formal organizations. These are not lone wolf hackers. These are organizations with health plans and retirement benefits They advertise jobs. These are formal telephones, offices. These are formal organizations. 46 countries had formal organizations providing commentary. 46 also maintained fake accounts to push public opinion. 38 of the countries used automated, fully automated, or cybernetic accounts to manipulate public opinion over social media. 31 of the countries, it was actually political parties, not government agencies, doing this work. And then in 10 of them, and this gives you a sense of where things are going, the primary platform of interest was WhatsApp, encrypted chat platforms, right? So this speaks, I think, illustrates the agility of planning around the manipulation of public opinion. It's no longer so much about online commentary. It's now about fairly direct engagement over encrypted chat. Now, if there's some doubt that these things are on the horizon, let me offer you a couple of examples of the AI applications that I think are actively in our conversation about the role of technology in politics. I don't believe that we saw very sophisticated machine learning so far in the elections that we've studied, but the machine learning that is applied to create text, right, to estimate who you are, come up with some classify you. The algorithms that classify you and then distribute content to you tend to be created by individuals who work with particular types of content. So these are political campaign managers. They're not interested in building public knowledge about a social problem. They're interested in using the tropes from the liberal blogosphere and serving that stuff to liberals. They're interested in pulling from the conservative blogosphere and serving that content up to conservatives. This figure is actually from 2004. It demonstrates the lack of ties between the conservative and liberal blogospheres in the United States, and it is still the basis for a significant amount of content creation now over social media. This is an example of an AI that debates. IBM's Noah Ovadia successfully completed a debate in San Francisco. It argued for more public spending on space exploration. So engineers are working on the craft of creating not only AI that can process large amounts of data, but on the composition of arguments that have political meaning, right? Political value. If one can develop an AI that makes convincing arguments, what political party would not spend money on a conservative AI or a labor AI that would help compose arguments and deliver them to publics? We already know about the AI that can be used to compose and alter images, to create videos. I think we're at a sort of one of the nice stories here is that the technology for capturing fake videos is better than the technology for producing it. That may not last, right? That may not last long, but I would guess in the near future we'll start to see these applications that involve taking trusted politicians, some of the figures that we trust in public life, and putting words in their mouths, delivering content to the people who will be most susceptible, most interested in the content. This is an interesting application of AI that helps identify using satellite images where poverty exists around the world. The top row is a fairly straightforward map of human settlements. The middle row is the redux. These are night glows, right? The glow of the cities at night, as caught in relief by satellites. What's interesting about this particular application is that it turns out it's not simply whether a human settlement has lights that makes it possible to estimate the level of poverty, because a rural area that's very poor may have the same level of lumens at night as a wealthy area that's also sparsely populated. What's interesting about this application is that the AI that was used to crunch the data, the satellite data, not only pulled in more different kinds of images than ever before for estimating poverty using light, but it actually worked out that the better predictor was that the light revealed something about rooftop materials, right? So the power of AI and political inference is being able to make these lateral moves across variables that social scientists wouldn't have thought of, policy experts would not have thought of. So it's actually the exposure of rooftop materials that makes it possible for a government to estimate where social services might be most needed. Right? So this is probably a good example of the service delivery options that in a narrow sense might be used to improve welfare. I think in the next few years, I think it'll be safe to say that every national security crisis, every new budget bill, every new tax bill will come with some kind of automated campaign for it and against it. Sort of every complex humanitarian disaster, every school shooting, every moment there's an immigration crisis of some kind, there will be automation behind the programming, behind the messaging over what to do. The original writ of our research project was to try to see how the Russian government and the Chinese government were using social media to manipulate public opinion in the West. We haven't seen much activity from the Chinese government. We know that they've gone after Taiwan. We know they've meddled in Taiwanese politics. We know that over social media. We know that there's pretty consistent messaging targeting Tibetans in exile and some of the issues that the Chinese government feels is important, but we haven't seen the same level of contribution that we saw from the Russian government. And sometime in the next, perhaps month, in a sense it's unfair to put the EU in this same bubble, but sometime in the next month, perhaps 2 months, the EU will regulate what counts as political speech, valid political speech, and will find ways to make social media platforms be more responsible for the content that appears on their platforms. Whatever guidelines they come up with will not be scalable, will not be just for Europe. There will be no way of simply providing these guidelines, these rules for European citizens. They will be a global rollout. I think it's safe to say that beyond that, forget what you think of any particular election, every special issue, every significant industry interest will come with a significant automated campaign for or against. It may be a while before we see genuine artificial intelligence actually taking your credit card records, composing a message, preparing the face that should deliver the message, and presenting that to you. But in countries where there's very little regulation over data mining, we can already see these complex threads between credit card records and messaging delivery. One of the best or worst examples of this is of credit card records and contraceptives in the US. If you purchase contraceptives on your credit cards, you're not pro-life, right? And the pro-choice movement wants that data. If you have never purchased contraceptives on your credit cards, you might be pro-life. And the pro-life movement will want that data because it affects what they prepare and mail to you in their mailers. So we know these threads exist between data and political messaging. The question is, how will they be used to shape AI and political AI? Now, where I want to land with this is that it's not too late to do something, to set up the good infrastructure for the AI, the political AI that we might want. The solution, I believe, is in making sure that there's good diversity to the data that trains AI. Much of the AI that we've seen so far is largely experimental, right? And it's based on very rarefied training data sets. There have been very few examples of full public policy rollouts of AI trying to tackle public problems. But I think it's also safe to say that the best data on public values no longer resides in the British Library. It no longer resides in the Library of Congress. It sits in Silicon Valley. It's in private hands. Sometimes academics, researchers are able to play with this kind of data, but for the most part, the data that is building AI is not in the public sphere. Now I want to take the two parts, in the last 5 minutes or so, the two parts of my definition of what AI is and what politics is, and try to build a sense of build an argument for what I think politics will become. I think for the most part, we have had humans as politicians that we elect and arbitrate. They argue, they meet in parliament, they ask tough questions, they sometimes misbehave. But for the most part, it's humans that have been the primary mode of representing our interests in creating this state. AI will start to take on some of that representative function for us in fairly short order. As AI learns to classify your values and your needs and your priorities, and is employed to help determine how the government should provide assets or how industry should be creative, it may become one of the most important modes of representation you have to public life. Now, part of the solution, I think there's two parts, and one of them, of course, involves the OII. Figuring out how to retrain social science, redefine the social sciences, is extremely important. We're used to playing with data that is attitudinal or aspirational, not truly behavioral. And the same data that's going to build political AI is now available to us in small slivers, right? Unless we're working within Facebook, it's available to us in small slivers. But developing the tools, the toolkit, for working with this kind of behavioral data is very important for the social sciences. So we at the OII, I think we're a relatively neutral platform. With the 2 degrees, we're trying to, on social science of the internet and social data science, we're trying to revolutionize the discipline, to rewrite how the discipline works. I think it'll be very difficult to do a degree in the social sciences in the years ahead without learning to play with some of the data and work on the inferences that AI will make. It'll be difficult to have an impact in social science without being able to play with this data. So the deep question, I think, for us, assuming we're interested in preserving democracy, is how to create the data sets that don't just sit in Silicon Valley, the data sets that can be used to create civically minded AI applications. And I have 5 ideas for getting us there. I think if we did any 2 of these, we'd make some good steps. The first idea is straightforward, and I ripped it from the Blood Diamonds campaign. Right? One of the great innovations of the Blood Diamonds campaign was that if you could report the source of the diamond, you could educate consumers. Consumers would not want to buy the diamonds that came with an ugly provenance. We as individuals should be able to look at any device that we have and ask it to tell us who's benefiting from our data. Every IoT refrigerator, every health tracker should be able to report who's benefiting at the end point with the information that we collect. Then in my fantasy world, we should be able to add to the list of organizations that benefit from that data. So at the moment, the data is collected by social media firms. It tends to sit in Silicon Valley, and it's sold off to, rented off to third-party organizations that we have no sense of where the data goes. It rarely ends up with government and public policymakers. But being able to say, as a citizen, that I want to add to my data set. I want to support my favorite Haitian coffee collective, right, with my coffee consumption data, should be one of my modes of civic engagement in the years ahead. I think it should be possible to build an infrastructure that tithes, right? If 10% of the data that comes out of the Wi-Fi routers or the phones could end up with our public health researchers, perhaps with our public science agencies, right? Still protecting privacy and working with researchers who abide by human subjects guidelines, those should certainly be in place. But not all of the data that is collected over our information infrastructure should end up in private hands. Some fraction of it will be useful to us in public life. For those of us, perhaps those civil society groups, that might want to try their hand at building their own AIs, right, for policy applications. One of the few rules that democracies have about profiting from the sale of data is that you're not supposed to profit from the sale of voter registration files. When you do data merging, you can profit from all the other things that you add to information about how you last voted, but you're not supposed to profit from that one linked, that one linked variable. It should be possible to extend the no profit rule to a set of, let's start with public health variables, a set of variables that could shape what counts as new generative ideas from AI, and keep the ideas that those AIs generate in the public sphere. Perhaps the last one is the most least likely to happen, right? The possibility of actually auditing a political AI. So when a minister in this country decides to apply a new AI to allocating resources, we as citizens should be able to examine the results and unpack them and question them. It's not clear that we have the government processes for doing this now, but if we want to keep this Leviathan as an organization, a state that serves us well, it'll be very important to create the processes for doing algorithmic audits. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. In a sense, I'm ending on an article of faith. I believe that it must be possible to build AIs that would serve us well in public policy questions. But I would say at the moment, we've got an environment that is still very much Wild West, in which political parties and government bureaucracies are playing with AIs in ways that we may not fully appreciate the applications, we may not like the applications. And being constructive and systematic about how AI gets used in public life will be key to making sure that we have a structure we like and a structure that preserves democratic values. Thank you for your time tonight. I'm happy to take questions.
Phil, as expected, that was wonderfully insightful and provocative, although I fear that it's made me even more depressed about politics than perhaps I already was, which I didn't think was possible. So I'm really glad that we ended on some strategies for the future, whereby if we intervene now, might make things a little bit more positive. We do now have time, about half an hour for questions from the audience. I'm going to let Phil choose your own questions, but in order to get picked, if you can please put up your hand, and you're going to take a microphone, wait for a microphone to come to you, and if you can then ask your question, and just bear in mind as at the beginning that it is being recorded. Okay, so yeah, who would like to ask a question? Fantastic.
Thank you. Fun. And maybe will do me an honor as a speaker, we'll go boy, girl, boy, girl. So our first speaker. The first question.
Hi. Particularly in the last sort of conclusion, you seem to be treating Facebook, Google, etc., and their kind of vertically integrated infrastructure as a given. Why can't they be separated from their data? Why can't that sort of function of data stewardship be taken away from them?
I think that it will be I don't think it's realistic to take back Facebook or undo Google. I also believe that we have lost the first way round of the privacy war. I don't see how we can keep the innovative. We want to continue, having tech innovations that do creative things and improve qualities of life. So I don't see how we can undo the current recipe we have for innovation and the trade-off we've made with advertising and data. I think that the next best thing is to ensure that the next form of infrastructure has the civics baked into it more deeply than it did. Thank you. What else? Please. Thank you. Back row. Yeah.
I was wondering about the regulation issue. As you said, the EU is preparing a regulation of political speech on social media platforms. Do you expect these type of regulations that will come in the future to resonate? I mean, how will they resonate in authoritarian regimes? Do you expect more censorship, or will it be better for us living in those countries? But also, I mean, are there any alternative solutions rather than just thinking or jumping onto the regulation issue?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So I think your instinct is right that authoritarian regimes like to see democracies struggle with this, or like to see democracies toy with the idea of content regulation. My instinct is that it's much better to do market-based nudges, to try to encourage competition, provide new firms that might design platforms that would protect privacy. Right? That would be one mode of getting more out of tech. When we come up with new modes of censorship, authoritarian regimes copy those modes very quickly. I think it's part of the magic, part of the recipe has to be putting the civic back in. Right? The thing that composes the state is all of our individual interests. And at the moment, I don't have a way of recovering my data and donating it to the hospital or faith-based group or university researchers that I want to donate to. And so I think, and in the sense this speaks to the earlier question, putting the civic back in is going to be key to making sure that AI is simply not put into the service of industry or big government, but is put into civil service for us. What else? This side, please. Sue.
If we can't take back Facebook and Google, that's implicitly saying that's because our political institutions aren't strong enough or don't have the desire to do so. That being the case, and Google and Facebook no doubt being as opposed to your 5 propositions as they are to the wholesale release of their data, what's the politics of the delivery of your propositions?
So I think we already have several organizations that are used to managing data in sensitive ways and providing access to researchers. Here it's the UKRI. In the US, it's the National Science Foundation. In the EU, it's the ERC. These are all massive organizations dedicated to peer review, managing ethics compliance, significant oversight of budgets. And I think if you've passed peer review, if you can meet the human subjects requirements of the ethics committee, and you have the financial approval to manage millions of euros, dollars, or pounds in research budgets, you're already well set up. The team is well equipped to manage carefully the data that currently sits in Silicon Valley. So the recommendation I'm flogging is that we use our existing infrastructure for distributing public science money to distribute access to the data that's going to be so powerful to creativity in the social sciences and in the computer sciences. I'd use our existing infrastructure. Thank you. Front row, and then back blue shirt. But then 2 girls.
Hello, thank you very much for this. You talked about the definition of politics today and the definition of politics in the AI world. If you had to extrapolate, how will we change the definition of truth and belief in the AI world?
I think, and next will be in the top corner there. I think that one healthy way forward would be to design AI, to build AIs that have to handle political questions with fresh data, rather than the data that's already on the internet. Right? The stuff that we already know as doesn't represent truths as well, represents some of our basest instincts, some of the things that are nasty, brutish, and short in our, how we deal with each other. So, we're talking very abstractly here without a particular public policy problem, but starting fresh with new data that we're confident represents lived experience would be one way to ensure that truths are used to educate AI. If we're not confident that the training data represents lived experience, then we're more likely to end up with AI that reinforces, right, or makes poor decisions, or AI that doesn't actually solve the public policy questions that we've put to it. Starting fresh, I think, is going to be part of the recipe for success. Please.
You mention that as one of your 5 proposed ways, there needs to be a set of variables that should not be the subject of profit. I don't know if this connects to the point I think made by the first questioner who was talking about privacy. I have in mind the whole logic outlined by Zuboff in Surveillance Capitalism. Are you saying that, is that connected to this point basically, like is privacy somehow a variable you're saying? Or yes, what do you mean basically is what I'm trying to articulate. I'm confused.
You're confused. Which part of it is?
Okay, I'll just
part
go
of the
then.
Zuboff?
Yeah, to be more simple then, what are these sets of variables that shouldn't be the subject of profit then?
So my preference as a researcher would be that it would be an expansive set of variables that are connected to the public policy questions we want to address. But I would concede that it'll be difficult to get out of a regulatory regime or Silicon Valley. So let's start with public health variables, things that might be related to cancer, teen suicide, a set of issues that we all care about and want to solve. I think once we set up the mechanism for asking social media firms to provide the data that would help us do machine learning, we can start to add some of the social ones that may be more sensitive. There was a fabulous op-ed in today's Times by Tim Wu who argues that on many public policy issues, there actually is surprising consensus. One of the challenges we have in our political systems of modern democracy is that parties don't represent all of that diversity well. And so AI might be one mechanism for figuring out what people really do want on gun control, what our values actually are on immigration, and figuring out how to express that consensus could be part of our work as a new breed of social scientists. What else? 1, and then 2. Thank you.
Okay, so we have Googles and Facebooks in the West, in this place, but we also, China has got its Alibaba's, Tencent, and everything else, and it's putting a lot of investment into AI research, and there's a different culture in terms of government-citizen relationships as well, like in the case of social credit system, for example. And we do see that some of the elements of their this type of mechanisms are actually exported to the other countries as well. And given that politics, the US created Trump, we have got very different issues in other Western countries as well. Do you see that this sort of digital dominance and digital investment in Asia might potentially threaten or change the balance of democracies in the West as well?
Thank you for that question. So my answer would be that it's likely that there will be something that looks like an authoritarian AI that is written with the assumptions that cultural control and stability are more important than creativity or freedom of expression. So I think it's conceivable that there would be, if there's labor AI and conservative AI, there might well be authoritarian AI and AIs that do work on public policy questions with democratic norms. I would also say that I think most of the creativity in machine learning applications happens in the West. So I think there's some rhetorical flourish to what authoritarian regimes say they're doing when it comes to investing in AI. The Chinese applications are unusual in that they're for surveillance, right? They're applications that are purely surveillance based, and trying to motivate behavioral change. And perhaps that's another good question for us. What would be our tolerance level in a democracy for the behavioral change that is part of providing governance goods, right? So if there's clear consensus that smoking causes cancer, the 70 years of medical consensus that smoking causes cancer, there's not a debate. In a democracy, would we want AI to set up some mechanism of public credits, welfare checks that were pegged to quitting smoking? We're getting very abstract here for a situation that doesn't really exist, but this is valuable because these scenarios are going to become more and more plausible as some governments figure out ways of punishing and sanctioning citizens, and other governments consider applying those techniques. And then in the middle.
Thank you. My question is about the governance goods. Especially many European countries have public broadcasting companies, but when we think about the data, AI, and platform economy, most of the companies are private. Do you see that governments anywhere in the world might try to enter the game by establishing any kind of public interest companies in data, AI, or platforms?
That is an interesting question. That's 4 or 5 steps down. I don't believe. I think an authoritarian regime might consider sinking significant resources into developing AI that helps maintain social control. I don't see democracies as governments doing that. I see them providing the credits to sponsor research that would do that. I'm not sure that I would advocate for more government spending directly on AI. I think that's. I don't think civil society is equipped right now to track this as a public policy issue. To have more government spending in AI that was about equipping government agencies to provide sanctions is probably a path that. This is probably something that will define authoritarianism 10 years from now. I think this will be core to the definition of authoritarianism, and not doing these things will be core to the definition of democracy 10 years from now. Thank you. Okay, we're somewhat falling behind here. Is 1 and then 2. And then 2 ladies.
Yeah. I guess I had a question about this question of politics being what happens when someone tries to represent your interests. And in politics, I think oftentimes the will of the minority is often sacrificed for the sake of the majority. And this particularly happens in cases of applications of AI in the civic sector already. Think of the facial recognition applications by police as a good example. Mm-hmm. So in your strategies, do you think there are specific strategies we can implement to avoid that kind of scenario from occurring, where in high-stakes civic tech, task definition of what kinds of technologies we would want to apply that may harm minority rights are avoided, even though they may benefit the majority as a whole?
Mm-hmm. So you may have noticed that we haven't talked about trolleys at all, right? And one of the reasons for that is, for those of us who think about these things, that we would like to assume that the tasks that are given to AI are already bounded in a way that, with the setting the AI up to succeed, right? So there should never be a design scenario in a democracy where AI is forced to choose between the allocation of public resources on the basis of race, right? That should never be an option in a democracy. Expressing that and coding that and ensuring that government ministries are abiding by that will be part of the project for us as citizens to be diligent. It's conceivable in these authoritarian scenarios that a government might decide to allocate public resources on the basis of race or nation of origin or a range of other things that are politically sensitive for an authoritarian regime, but are in democracies we've decided are not the basis for discrimination. Up front, thank you.
I was just interested in on your 5 points there. You didn't have anything to do with education and us as people, because if you really want a civil interaction at an AI level, then we as people need to understand it and be educated so that we can actually ensure that takes place. And I think that's probably going to be our biggest challenge, because we're not very good with technology. Anything that's can do great things tends to be able to do great harm as well. We're not very good at dealing with that dilemma.
Yep. I think all I can offer is a response on this, and that is to admit that I think higher education has largely failed to teach some of those critical thinking skills on media pretty systematically in many countries around the world. Or the things that we've taught as critical thinking have not been taught with trust right? So we teach people to automatically doubt everything that a politician says or everything that every newspaper says, and that has led to declining trust in many different kinds of institutions. So I would say that you're right, a long-term trajectory, a healthy investment would be to teach us all about how decisions are made, politically important decisions are made using AI. Universities need to work on, and high schools need to work on what that curriculum is, because I think we have not been getting it right. Yeah. This is a two-finger. Okay, may we have a mic up front, and then we'll go to the back.
It's kind of tacking a question onto that, actually, about how we can encourage citizens to really value their data and take ownership of it. It seems to me that at the moment people don't fully understand not just where it goes to, who the beneficiary is, but actually what on earth is the point of even caring, given their data is so small and unimportant and so on. How, it's not just the critical thinking in universities that will tackle that problem. Surely it's much more fundamental than that, about this being a natural resource that individuals own and therefore can control, and how do we get to that point of being able to control it?
Control it. Earlier on, there was a question about what governments and democracies might do to set up AI to succeed nicely for us in the political sphere. And perhaps I should have reinforced that it's up to that civic expression that may ensure that we as citizens learn about how our data is used, that we take it back from the organizations that don't use it well and give it to the ones that we want to support. I think as the meaning of politics and representation changes, as it becomes algorithmic, what we do with our data will become the mode of expression. I don't want to go too far on this. Voting will still be important, but between those modes, between those moments that we show up on voting day, there's a significant swath of data that we generate that is used to generate political inferences about what we want. And being a citizen will mean learning to manage our data, and it'll mean learning to express ourselves as we like through our data. One or two more. Somebody who hasn't had a chance to speak. Okay, one over here, thank you. One, and then two, hat. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just thinking about consumer awareness and also American culture, and about the sense of control that people have. And isn't there a worry that it could become a left versus right argument about what people do with their data? So with gun control, it's about not giving the state control. And then it could become this, how I give my data, who I give my data to becomes a control issue, which is ideological and not tied to fact.
I think one of the things that will be difficult for us to navigate is that so much of the creative work in AI happens in the US, and there is no federal agency that will regulate any of this anytime soon. I think DCMS in this country is staffed with high-functioning individuals who know the issues and are likely to make good calls about what AI might do for civic life in this country. The same thing can be said for Europe. I don't know how much impact DCMS and the Commission will have on what regulations tech companies in Silicon Valley face. I think they will have to abide by some of the guidelines that shape the content arriving in your stream, in your social media feed. Silicon Valley firms have to play by the GDPR rules at this point. But I don't know how to answer the AI question on this, because I agree the culture of political expression is so different. What counts as political speech there is so different and so strongly protected and so strangely defined compared to how other political cultures understand political speech. I think that's going to be another challenge for us. Figuring out how to shape AI development in the United States is one of the tougher parts of this problem. Please, yeah.
Thanks. I think it's partly on the question on regulation. You just mentioned it. You have a GDPR. We've had it now for more than a year. I'm actually not sure what the numbers are in terms of if you've done some stats on that, if we have actually had a better outcome of that. But it seems that that's actually catching up a way of politics or politicians trying to catch up on technology. And the question is, how realistic is it to try to instigate this regulation when you can see that most companies or people, when you send them an email with the GDPR, how many people for example, in the audience will actually respond to those emails and actually consent to be able to get future information? And that's just another level of hassle for the general consumer. And the question is, how will that regulation actually be realistic in the future if you're asking the questions of consenting your information for science or whatever?
So this is a good question because you are absolutely right. Most of us, most of the time, don't think about politics, right? We do this in the 3 days leading up to election. We do this when there's a crisis in the news. We do this when there's something that affects a member of our family. But most of the time, it's other stuff that we're consuming. I would say that some of these ideas about data portability are only 1 or 2 steps away from what GDPR has achieved. And I'm a GDPR fan, so I do think it has done good things to the public's, to individuals' ability to preserve, understand where their data goes and where it travels. The next, I believe, a next reasonable step would be to empower the citizen to be able to take the data, if not remove it from an organization that's collected it, at least copy it and donate it as well. Because this process of sharing data, I think, is going to be an increasingly important part of what counts as civic expression. If we don't have that, then the information about our preferences, the information that generates political inferences, won't be under our control. It'll stay in private hands or with governments. So I think the steps are I don't think they're big leaps. Please, one, and then who else? 2 more then.
I wanted to say thank you for an exciting and very informative talk.
Thank you.
My question is very practical. For those of us who are not part of OII, what would you recommend in terms of getting more information about this important topic and important debate, which unfortunately to me seems to be very much limited to the academic world and really unreported widely and not accessible to the public? So any sources of information that you would recommend, just a few?
So DCMS released a major report a few weeks ago on misinformation in public life, and I found it readable and accessible. I know reading a government white paper may not be the recommendation that you were looking for there. I do find that over the last couple of years, our wonderful journalist friends who may be in the audience have been getting better at reporting technology issues. Now, whenever there's an election, there's always a few stories about social media manipulation attached to it. Whenever there's a public crisis, misinformation is one of the news pegs now. So, to get back to this question of education, I would say one of the best things you can do is make a decision for yourself about which news outlets you do trust. Diversify them a little bit. Yeah. So pick a paper that you don't normally read once in a while, yeah, and watch the technology columns, the technology authors there, because the level of interest in this from journalists is on the rise, and they're getting much better. In fact, they're doing their own investigative work. So at this point, we're no longer studying Facebook or Instagram. We're on to WhatsApp, mostly because it's such a methodology challenge. But there are now several major news organizations that have investigative units that are tracking this stuff. And I think that's one of we are learning here. The pursuit is paying off. One last one, please, blue shirt. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. You lumped together 3 sorts of actors, so state, political parties, traditional political organizations, and non-state Russian troll farms of various sorts. And actually the vast majority of the examples you cited were about the final group and their effective potential triumph over the last electoral cycle. How do you see that sort of race playing out over the next decade or so? And do you see that final group is perhaps thrown its dice and kind of lost the game, and the state is now going to take over with its vastly greater resources and access to data?
I think a significant amount of the innovation in political AI will come from political parties in democracies. I also think that in part this is again driven by the US presidential cycle. It is in a US presidential year that hundreds of millions of dollars are poured into innovative new campaign techniques. The campaign managers who work on these campaigns after a presidential year come to the UK, go to Canada, go to Oz, practice their trade. They're consultants, yeah? And it's a global industry. Then they go to the Scandinavian countries, Germany, and they apply the tricks that they've developed in the last presidential year. Then they go to Saudi, they visit Bahrain and to Russia and China, and then back to the next presidential election race. So I think that machine learning advances are happening in the academy. They're being advanced by governments and militaries. But the most express political application of them will probably come from political parties that want to use AI to craft their arguments and unload content on voters. Thank you all. We have a reception, and I'm happy to stay for more questions and a glass of something. Thank you for coming tonight.
Phil is absolutely correct. We have drinks awaiting us downstairs in the flowers room, so I hope that you can stay for another half hour to continue the conversation. Please also keep an eye on our website and our Twitter feed for future events, and I'm hoping that we're going to be back in London next term with another fantastic speaker. But yeah, again, thank you, Phil, so much for a really fantastic evening. Thank you.